And I think we're now ready to go. And so I'm continuing with the theme, as I say, of the last few weeks, and the theme has been on the economy and the election. And I will just say very briefly, we'll go a little bit more into it in the next little bit, that the rise of Donald Trump at the polls continues this last week. Um, I'm not suggesting that the polls give us a clear-cut winner in this election. I think quite the opposite, that this is still very much a dead heat based on what we're seeing in the polls. And in addition, of course, the polls are not flawless or not perfectly insightful into what's actually happening in the American electorate. But having said that, there is a clear trend that the polls are picking up, which is growing support for Donald Trump. And this is true, it appears, in the swing states, which matter most, but across the board in the United States. And so I'll say two things about this very quickly at the outset. And so I know the room well enough to know that most of us are not going to be very happy with the second Donald Trump term as president.
That's right.
That's a
That's right.
understatement. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. Were you saying something?
Oh, that's agreed.
Yeah. Okay. Agreed. Okay. And I'll tell you what. I'm going to mute everyone. I suspect I was picking up the chorus as opposed to somebody trying to comment. But whenever you want to comment, just unmute yourself, raise your hand, put it in the chat, whatever's easiest for you. But having said that, right, I think two things are going to be incumbent upon us if Donald Trump does win this election. And by us, I mean those of us who do not support him, and not only don't support him, but will be aghast at his victory. And the first is to figure out why he won. Right. And not just from a narrowly strategic perspective, what can the Democrats do better next time? There will be enough of that. But I think from a broader perspective of recognition that roughly half the American people consider Donald Trump to be better than Kamala Harris is indicative of the fact that the half that considers Donald Trump to be noxious, to be a threat to American democracy, to be temperamentally ill equipped to be the president of the United States, isn't getting the other half of American. And I like to put this in terms of a marital dispute, right? I think many of us have been married. Probably we have had occasional disputes in our marriage. If the stance you take in that dispute is, I am 100% right and you are 100% wrong, and the only thing I need to figure out is how you can be so wrong, you're not going to get very far in resolving that dispute or building that relationship or figuring out how to grow together, right? And I think in a parallel or analogous way, something similar applies to democracy. We need to understand rather than simply demonize our fellow citizens. And so part of the work of this series of classes is trying to get us to a place where maybe we have a little better understanding of why it is that for a substantial portion of our population, in ways I'm about to show, Donald Trump represents not a threat to democracy, but true democracy. Donald Trump represents not a convicted felon, but the only person who is actually going to speak to the true needs of true Americans. So that's one thing I think is going to be incumbent upon us. And please note, even if Harris wins, the fact that a substantial portion of the population voted for Donald Trump makes it similarly imperative, maybe not quite as much an emergency, but that we figure out how to understand the motivation, the concerns, the desire to be heard, and the way in which now we can hopefully put Donald Trump to one side, But 21st century populism represents something that is highly appealing to a large number of Americans, right? And so that's task number one, that comes out of this election, in a sense, irrespective of what the outcome is. Task number two is really specific to if Donald Trump wins. And again, something we need to think more about, and that I'm continuing to think through in order to teach in the event that there is a Trump victory. And that is, to the extent that we consider some of what Donald Trump is likely to do to be unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, inhumane, right? And so in the first instance, rounding up millions of Americans in order to deport them, an effort that I hope, frankly, there won't be the staff, the resources, the legal authority to do. But should it succeed, should, right, the logistics of it be put in place, I am inclined to think that this is the kind of policy that we should not just say, he was elected, he gets to do it. That there needs to be some resistance to it. But then I want to add two things. I think the resistance has to be of a kind that communicates to our fellow citizens who support this policy in a way that allows our humanitarian and principled objections to it to reach them, right? That it be, if you will, effective civil disobedience, the way in which the right sit-ins at the lunch counters in the segregated South, the freedom rides, the freedom summer, succeeded in reaching a large number of Americans who were frankly indifferent to or even supportive of the Jim Crow South, and exposed for them the clear-cut moral objections to it in ways that were actually suasive, actually convinced them to change their minds. We're going to need to start thinking about how to reach our fellow citizens as we resist the policy of the president that they have elected to implement that policy, right? And so that's going to be a tricky position. And then I'm going to say one more thing about this. Another, I think, category of policy that definitely will require resistance is policy that targets political enemies, i.e., the opposition, people who didn't vote for him, people within the Republican Party who refused to say in 2020 or maybe in 2024 that the vote was rigged and that Donald Trump really won 2020. If he starts using the Department of Justice or the FBI or, heaven forbid, the American military to go after his political opponents, then again, we're going to have to resist. And here I want to say something somewhat different, right? You probably noticed among the news of this week that both the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post are refusing or changing their policy and not endorsing, right? So they're not endorsing Donald Trump, but they're also not endorsing Kamala Harris. And I want to speak in particular to the Washington Post. The Times, as you've seen, the editor and some journalists have quit in protest for this. But with the Post, right, the Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, arguably the second richest man in the world or among the richest men in the world. And someone who it would seem, if anyone, can with safety have the courage to stand up against a potentially vengeful and vicious president. But Bezos is apparently choosing not to. And the issue here seems to trace back to Donald Trump's first term and all of the interference that Donald Trump threw up to Amazon's commercial success, and that Bezos doesn't want to have to run into those headwinds again. Please note, in a sense, right, at this point, you have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos both trying to anticipate a Trump administration, and on the one hand, how it might benefit him, and on the other hand, how he can minimize the damages. And please note that tariffs, right, especially higher tariffs against Chinese goods, will be a threat to Amazon's business model, as obviously would be a president who wants to use the power of the executive branch to punish his political enemies. So, two things we need to be thinking about. I'm hoping that the lecture today will be preparatory for those thoughts, should they be necessary. The second is different from the first, and this involves how to engage in resistance or civil disobedience to express our principled rejection of policy in ways that are not only effective at communicating to the other side, but collectively create safety, a safe space for those of us who are dissident in a second Trump administration to express our dissidence with safety. I'll say one more thing at the outset, and that is that obviously on our minds outside of the contemporary election is, among other things, the fact that Israel launched an attack on Iran, right, in retaliation for the attack that Iran launched on Israel, in retaliation for the Israeli assassination of leaders of Hezbollah and Iranian Revolutionary Guard leaders. And I could say a lot about Israel today. I'm not going to, but I will just note that this appears to have been calibrated in a way to be proportionate, right? It didn't go after the energy sector. It didn't go after the nuclear facilities. It didn't go after Iranian leaders. It went after exclusively military targets and air defense systems and missile systems, the kind of stuff that Israel is directly concerned about in terms of its own security, and that Iran does not yet appear to be talking about a further retaliatory attack. And in a sense, maybe we are fortunate. I think clearly we are fortunate. Let me revise that Iran is in a relatively weak place as a regime, both economically and militarily, and doesn't want to see a ratcheting up of the war. I just am wanting to underline, right, that Joe Biden and his administration got a pledge from Benjamin Netanyahu and his administration that the Israelis would not go after the nuclear facilities, the energy infrastructure, the leadership of Iran. And to just note, right, how much the presidency matters for containing international conflict, for deterring international aggression. I don't want to suggest that the United States is in the position that it was 30 years ago when it was the single unrivaled superpower in the world, and frankly, where probably its reputation exaggerated its military influence. But I still think American foreign policy matters greatly, and that we should be weighing that, among other things, as we vote in the next 10 days. So, into today's lecture, and you may be perplexed by my title, Why Bidenomics, why the success of Bidenomics may cost Harris the election and ultimately help Trump if he wins a second term. And so I am going to suggest today that in many ways, the Biden administration economically did more or less exactly what it set out to do. And in so doing, it learned the lesson of the failures of not only the Obama administration, but much of the economic policy of the United States of the last 40 plus years. And that it's quite remarkable that they did as well in executing a economic plan, economic planning, given the limited tools available to the President of the United States, given the very small margin that they had in Congress, given the complexity of the 21st century American economy, given the interconnection of our economy with the rest of the world, it's not a propitious environment for executing successful economic plans. And yet it seems to me that Biden and Jared Bernstein and his economic team did this extraordinarily well. And that the byproduct of their economic plan, the goal of their economic plan, just to be as clear as possible, Jared Bernstein put it this way in the first months of the Biden administration: run the economy hot. And what that really means is, right, in the depth of the COVID recession, which Biden inherited not just from Trump, but really from global events. A pandemic isn't anybody's fault, but nevertheless, Biden takes over in a deep recession. The idea is really stimulate this economy, do as much as possible to get us out of the recession as quickly as possible, and in a way that generates strong economic growth, to generate strong demand for labor, to generate strong wage growth, especially at the bottom of the wage scale. And then, for the first time in 40 plus years, maybe we can emerge from a recession with the workers, the people at the bottom, the middle class, better off, right? And that was the pattern in the 1950s and the 1960s, but it's been the opposite since then. And lo and behold, that's exactly what has happened the last year and a half. And then, of course, doing that, any economist will tell you, anybody who thinks a little bit about economic policy will tell you, risks inflation. You're running the economy hot. You're trying to create rapid growth. You're trying to create a tight labor market to increase wages that tends, by its very nature, to be inflationary. But in the 21st century, inflation is not the problem that it was in the 1970s, 1980s. We've learned enough about how to control inflation. We have enough trust in the Federal Reserve that we believe even if there's a period of inflation as a result, it will come back down under control pretty quickly. And in retrospect, again, that appears to be more or less what happened. Probably the inflation was higher and longer than the Biden administration wanted it to be. But here we are in the middle of a soft landing. At least it sure appears to be that way in the closing months of 2024. And it turns out, frankly, that people notice the inflation more and the wage growth less. And I want to continue to think that through today. I don't want to say that that is economically irrational, but I do want to say, in a sense, it's short-sighted. Because frankly, the inflation is coming back under control. The wage growth is real. Nobody knows where the economy is going, but it certainly appears that if we maintain the course, and it looks like the economy is really very strong, then 2, 3, 4 years from now, that wage growth will more than have made up for the phase shift in prices. Prices are higher in 2024, but if wages stay higher, wages will catch up with and then exceed the increase in prices. That is already happening. So, of course, the irony is that people are paying more attention to the inflation. That may cost Harris the election. If Trump doesn't screw this economy up. And I think there's a good chance that he will. I think tariffs and deportations are a recipe for disaster, economically speaking. But if he doesn't, then he may very well have several good economic years in which, again, workers really feel that they're better off with Donald Trump as president, despite the fact that it's really Joe Biden's policies that create the climate for increased economic security for people at the bottom of the economic scale. And so I want to try to understand this today a little bit better. I have on the board Jose Clemente Orozco's mural from Mexico City of quote, law and justice, right? And I don't know to what degree I'll be able to get into the politics of economics or political economy again today. That's where we started several weeks ago. But the right clear implication of Orozco's mural, right, justice with the blindfold obviously off at least one eye, the bloody handprint on her gown, law dancing with a terrible smile and a knife in its hand is very often justice and law work to the benefit of the wealthy are not really what they appear to be. And lo and behold, maybe Biden reversed this and yet is not going to succeed. So, very quickly, I won't spend but a second here, right? The updating of the polls does show movement in Trump's direction, continuing through, right, the end of October almost. We'll have to see next Tuesday. Kamala Harris will give a major address at the ellipse, her closing argument, a setting designed to evoke exactly what happened on January 6, 2021. And maybe she will succeed in returning the focus of voters to the danger that Donald Trump represents. But having said that, what appears to me to be happening right now is that Harris really moved up first just when she replaced Joe Biden and had a successful nominating convention, and then the memory of that faded and Donald Trump started to move up. And then, right, Harris did very well in the debate, not only for herself, but in exposing Donald Trump to be easily baited, and when he takes the bait to be out of control, easily manipulated, ill-tempered, and confused about fact, as Harris puts it, right? And so Trump fell back down, Harris went back up, and again that has faded. And so there does appear to be kind of reverting to the mean of an advantage to Donald Trump in this election. Can Harris turn it around one more time? I'm not sure. Most recent New York Times Siena poll shows the two of them tied, right? The average of the polls the New York Times has, so about a 1% lead for Harris. The apparent tilt in the Electoral College suggests that Harris needs to win probably by 3 to 4% to have a clear-cut path to victory in the Electoral College. And of course, tied or 1% is not where she needs to be. In terms of the issues, it is back to the case I've showed you in the past that Harris may have closed some of the gap with Trump maybe even in some polls overtaken him with regards to the economy. The most recent Times CNN poll, which is one of the best polls, right, in terms of both the number of people contacted and the sophistication of the methodology used, shows that Trump is back ahead on the economy. But I want to note, right, not dramatically ahead. And this, I think, feeds into what I want to talk with you about today. Why is Donald Trump perceived to be the better candidate on the economy? Why, in general, are the Republicans perceived to be better, but in particular, Donald Trump? And there, I want to suggest that there is a deep-seated disaffection with the way Democrats talk about economic policy, talk about the economy in general, and that understanding that is going to be critical to understanding what happens in 2024, but also how to do better in the future at justifying more progressive and also less scapegoating or targeting economic policy. On abortion, right? Harris is way out in front of Trump. And I'll just note very quickly, you put these two things together, and one, I think, hopeful scenario for Harris is the voter who says, the economy is more important to me, and I prefer Donald Trump. But abortion, that's a close second. And I just think Donald Trump's a little better than Kamala Harris on the economy, but I think Harris is a lot better than Donald Trump on abortion. If you get to that point, I think you can see a scenario in which the second most important issue actually leads a voter to vote for Harris. And like I say, we'll have plenty of time to work through the results of this election, but I do wonder whether abortion may be more potent than we're giving it credit for, and may ultimately create an opening for Harris. Immigration. And I want to talk about this for a moment, right? Clearly, Donald Trump has a substantial lead on immigration, not quite as substantial as Harris's lead on abortion, but a much more significant lead than he has on the economy. And here I want to suggest to you the polling that I'm seeing, you read the details, seems to indicate that for many Americans at least, the abortion issue, I'm sorry, the immigration issue is not quite understood the way in which Donald Trump is framing it. The question is not, are people coming over the border without authorization to be here and taking jobs from Americans? Or are they, those same people, taking housing from the native born? Right? Or those who are here with authorization or who have citizenship. The issue, I think, is deeper and more tightly coupled with the economic issue than maybe it first appears, but via different channels of connection. The issue appears to be much more one of social cohesion and identity. Who are we as a nation? And do the people flooding over our borders share that identity? Or do they only represent themselves or completely different cultural values? And this, I think, plays into a sense that the United States has lost its social cohesion that I believe is deeply rooted in the economic vulnerability of large portions of the population. We are hurting. We are losing ground. We are seeing the people around us having their economic security undermined, and the government and our fellow citizens are not doing enough about it. Maybe they're not even noticing or concerned. And that reflects the fact that they don't care about us. And that is explained by the fact that we have become too diverse to be compassionate for each other, or worse, that the liberal elite only cares about racial minorities and racial justice and feminism and LGBTQ trans people, right? And that idea that right, there's not enough compassion, not enough listening, not enough understanding of a large portion of our population who is also hurting and also deserves our compassion and our policy efforts. I think immigration captures that idea. Last, right, of the big issues here, democracy. And here Harris has a clear advantage, but please note it's actually smaller than the advantage that Trump has on the economy. And I think that may be baffling to some people, myself at points included. I think, wait a sec, one of these two people tried to overturn the election in 2020. One of these two people promises to use the Department of Justice and maybe the FBI and maybe the military to go after his political opponents. One of these two people has sown the seeds of widespread mistrust of the electoral system, which is, of course, the very foundation of American democracy. How can this be that close? And I want to immediately point out that I think there's another side to the coin, and we have to pay attention to this, which is that for a large number of Americans, neither of the political parties has been responsive to their needs or interests for a very long time. And Donald Trump at least appears to be paying attention to them, quote, feeling their pain, articulating their grievances, and for them, that's essential to the functioning of democracy. You have to have candidates for office who pay attention to your actual concerns. And Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party in a way that a large segment of the American electorate now feels it is better at representing, articulating their concerns. And so again, I think if Donald Trump wins this election, we should not be surprised that a substantial portion of voters are not persuaded by the idea that he is a threat to democracy, and instead view him as, in fact, a more democratic candidate. So you may have noticed this, right? Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, announced 2 days ago, I think it was, that Canada is going to radically reduce its quota for immigrants in the coming year. And I want to point out, first of all, just the fact that Trudeau can do that is indicative of the fact that Canada has a rational immigration policy, which is to say, each year Canada takes a census of its industries and universities and asks, how many immigrants do we need? And they set quotas for visas accordingly, right? But second of all, right, Trudeau is a quite unpopular incumbent, probably seeking re-election, and he's got his finger to the electoral winds, and he recognizes that in Canada, right, liberal, inclusive, tolerant Canada, Canada that has the highest score of migrant acceptance. This is from 2022, right? So maybe things have shifted, but that he is recognizing that even in one of the countries that has, generally speaking, the most liberal or favorable attitude towards immigrants, the tide of public opinion is turning against liberal immigration policy. And right, that means, right, that this is happening throughout the world, even in the most liberal countries. Note that the United States in 2022 was relatively liberal about immigration, top 10 at least in this regard. And so if it's happening in Canada. It's certainly happening in the United States. And again, I think this sense, not that it's necessarily a bad thing to have, right, people coming to your country attracted by the opportunity that is there, attracted by its liberty and its diversity, but also contributing to its labor force and assisting us, right, in sustaining Social Security and building affordable housing and cultivating our agriculture. Please note, right, that people are beginning to speak up in these industries, beginning to say, for instance, if you get rid of the people who are harvesting the fruit and vegetables in our society, well, the tomatoes are going to die on the vine. And then, right, you're going to have to import your tomatoes and your ketchup and your tomato sauce from Mexico and Italy. And if you put tariffs on those goods, right, not only are they going to be more expensive because instead of coming from California, they're coming from abroad, but they're going to be doubly more expensive because they're going to be taxed at the border. This could be highly inflationary. The topic of inflation is where I want to resume today. And we looked at this together last week, right? Every major economic indicator pointing to the fact that the economy is really humming along. And yet the limited value of indicators, something I found in doing some more research on this. Apparently, there was a survey last month. Are we in a period of economic growth or a period of economic recession? 46% of the respondents in America said we're in a period of recession, right? And what that means, I think, to be absolutely clear about this, is all of the positive economic indicators do not translate into a actual experience of economic competence, economic improvement, economic success for a large portion of Americans. And the way in which the economic indicator can be out of alignment with the lived experience of being an American in the 21st century economy comes out very clearly with the inflation data, right? The core inflation rate never got above really 8% in the worst of the inflationary times of 2022, back down to 2.5%. And yet the inflation of, right, food and fuel was up at 40%, right? 4 or 5 times as high as the core inflation rate, which is what everybody is reporting on. It doesn't seem like what you're hearing in the news, which your politicians or economists are indicating is the inflation rate, has any bearing to what's actually happening in your life. I want to look at one other indicator here. I like the idea of eggflation. And I want you to know, right? And this is important, right? A lot of people are talking about the price of eggs. How much does a dozen eggs cost, right? And from 2021 to the present, right? Eggs at some point in 2023 were almost twice as expensive. By the way, I think if you compare 2019 to 2024, if you pick your dates right, you can get 500% more expensive. And that's part of what I want to point out, right? So 80% more expensive, and then only 15% more expensive, and then 40% more expensive. If you choose your dates right, you have 40% inflation. If you choose them in a different way, you have 15% inflation. So not only is it the case, right, that eggs are more expensive and maybe 5 times more expensive than they were 5 years ago. It's also the case that there's a lot of room for manipulating, sorry, data, manipulating how you calculate the exact rate of inflation. And there are a lot of people, right, taking to TikTok, taking to Instagram, talking about the price of eggs. So we spoke a little bit again about this last week, very quickly, right? The idea that the Democratic coalition has been realigned by Donald Trump and Barack Obama. You take those two figures together, the two dominant political figures of the last 20 years, and the Democrats are attracting more and more affluent voters, still a very high share of poor voters as well, relatively poor, right? The bottom 20%. And trying to hold that coalition together, it's really hard, right? And that Donald Trump has really pulled a lot of uneducated voters, voters who don't have a college degree, into the Republican base, and that's making it harder for the Democrats. They are still the dominant party with regards to African Americans, still doing very well with regards to Hispanics, but coming down from where they were with Barack Obama, right? That this probably reflects the fact that, right, consumer confidence really still has not rebounded. The sense of the direction of the country still remains dominantly negative. And this perception that the Democratic Party is, quote, the Brahmin left, that it is the rich people's progressive party and not a party for working class, less well educated Americans. And in a sense, immigration remains the, I think, clear exhibit on this. If you are less well educated, if you're really concerned about maintaining your wages, then you may be very suspicious of immigration and wage competition that it generates. I think that that's often a misperception, but it's a real concern, right? And the idea that the Democrats have very often been much more liberal about immigration than gives further reason to think Donald Trump articulates our issues. He talks like us. He eats in the restaurants we eat in, and he's where we want him to be on the issues we're going to support Donald Trump. Now, this idea that Biden did just what he wanted to do, and this is information that I think is really important for us to be looking at and thinking about, right? This is real wage growth. This is inflation, nominal wage growth, so without inflation taken into account. And as you can see, right, in 2020, real wage growth was going along quite nicely until COVID hit. It drove wages down at first, and then inflation really shot up, and that kept wages down despite the fact that there was a lot of stimulus going into the economy. But please note, right, as inflation came down, and especially as we get into early 2023, wages came back up. And the result is that over the last 5 years, wages actually have come up for American workers. This is especially true for the bottom 10% who've seen their wages go up 12%. It's true for the group that goes from 20% to 40%, call them the working class, right? And their wages have gone up about 5% over the last 5 years. You take now the middle, right? 40% to 60%, call that the middle class. Wages have gone up 3%, right? And this is, I think, exactly what Biden had hoped. And yet, I also think that it's not benefiting him. Let me talk, first of all, about why he hoped to do this, why his economic team hoped to do this. And to see this, I think it's important to look at what has been happening to low income earners for the last 40 years. And so we have data on the left from Pew, and this data shows, right, what is called top biased income growth from 1981 to 2018, right? So through the end of the Great Recession or the end of Obama's presidency. And what you see, right, is that the bottom income group, the lowest fifth, actually loses income in the decade of the 1980s, whereas the top 5% really gains. The top 20% does quite nicely. More or less the same pattern occurs in the 1990s. It's a period of higher across the board wage growth, but still very top biased. 2000s, the first decade, especially because of the 2007 2008 recession, you see a lot of loss of income. And please note again, it's the poorest people, the people who can least afford it, who have the largest losses in income. And then again, 2011, 2018, as we're pulling out of the Great Recession, it's not as badly top biased, but it's still top biased. And this data on the right here gives us a little bit more of an indication of what this looks like, right? So what you see here, right, is that the poor and the middle class used to have the largest income growth. That's the data from 1980, right? So really going back to the 1970s. And in 2014, right, the people who are most affluent, the 0.001 percentile, have by far and away the highest income growth. And really, it's the top 5% who are seeing greater income growth. And as you can see, right, average income growth goes from 2% to 1.4%. Biden, Bernstein, his team want to try to reverse this trend, to come out of a recession in a way that benefits the people who've been left out of income and wealth creation for the last decade. And what the data shows is they precisely succeeded in doing that. And again, right, when we look at what happened in the aftermath of 2008, right, this is data from that goes from 2007 to 2016. The wealth, right, of the bottom 90% of families in the United States was dramatically impacted by the Great Recession. We'll talk more about this in a moment. Um, and then, right, slowly but surely, the bottom 90% started to pull out. The richest 10% saw their wealth less strongly decreased or hurt by the Great Recession and saw it rebound much more quickly. There's a simple reason for this, and you can see the breakdown with, the 25th percentile losing 37% of its wealth between 2007 and 2016, and the top 10% gaining wealth in that same period. The reason is quite simple, right? The reason is that the 2008 recession was caused by the burst of a housing bubble, right? The majority of people who are in the bottom 90%, the majority of wealth that they own is caught up in their houses. When housing values go down, even worse, as we're about to see, when people lose their houses, they lose their wealth. The top 10%, their wealth comes in the form not only of home ownership, but also of investments, of stocks and bonds, hedge funds, etc. And those asset classes recovered much more quickly. And the people who can account for more of their wealth in terms of those asset classes then recovered their wealth much more quickly. This gets us then to what I suggested is the fundamental problem in our economy, the one that has been exacerbated greatly by inflation, and even more importantly, that inflation really called our attention to, and that is the affordability crisis, right? It occurs in a context of rising inequality, of slowing growth and productivity growth in particular, of a shrinking middle class, but really the idea that housing, healthcare, higher education, child and elder care have all become significantly more expensive. The result is that either people are one way or another reducing the costs that they spend on these goods. We spoke last week about commuting further, living in less space, not buying your home, or else they're redistributing income from other classes, other categories, in order to be able to afford this stuff. They're not buying a house in order to be able to afford childcare, in order to be able to maintain the two careers that they think they need to survive in the 21st century. And that inflation, and I'll say this briefly and then come into this data quickly. The inflation, in ways we talked about last week, particularly hit the costs of goods that people had been, in a sense, compensating for the affordability crisis with. The goods that had actually not experienced as much inflation, that had actually, many of them, become much cheaper, right? And all of a sudden inflation makes TVs and gaming systems and phones and cars more expensive, and people really begin to focus on what was a slow simmering problem, right? You may not notice that your pasta is actually boiling until the pot boils over. You don't notice the affordability crisis as much until inflation really hits your eggs, your fast food, your gas prices, and then you're very focused on it. And so the irony is that Biden's approach, the Biden administration's approach to addressing the recession of 2020, 2021 is restoring some equality in wage growth, right? Getting the distribution right. It's generating inflation, and inflation has people more focused on their economic discontents. The longer term context for this, and again, I want to talk about wealth as much as income today. I want you to look at what the 2008 economic crisis did to us. And so these are housing foreclosures by quarter, right? And so this data goes from, let me see if I can figure this out, 2006 to 2022, right? And from 2007 through 2010, we averaged almost 450,000 foreclosures per quarter, close to 2 million per year, right? And so over those 3 years, the figure is actually higher than what this data is showing. It appears that 10 million Americans lost their homes. And this is what it did to household net worth. It has been recovering, but it's not yet. Well, I should be careful. It didn't get back quickly to where it had been because so many people lost their homes. And what we know as well, right, is that we never recovered in terms of home construction. We've talked about this before, right? One of the reasons we have an affordable housing crisis in the United States is that because for the last decade, we have not been building enough homes. This goes back maybe more than a decade to 2008. The Great Recession, right, dramatically reduced the number of homes being built, especially one unit structures. But please note that we don't build enough multi-family residents in the United States. And although it started to pick up again, right? The COVID drove it down, came back, but nowhere near where it should be or where it ought to be. And please note, right, while people who are older, right, 30, 40, 50, 60, do have a net positive rate of home ownership. They own homes more than they rent. People who are 20 to 30 are not able to get homes. And by the way, the 30 to 40-year-olds are still struggling. It's only really when you get up to 40 or 50-year-olds that you begin to see higher rates of home ownership in the United States. And this reflects that affordability crisis. And what being a renter and maybe thinking of yourself as a permanent renter does to you is to create a sense of lifelong economic insecurity. Prosperity is out of reach. I've got to anticipate that my rent may go up, that I may have to move out of the neighborhood that I want to live in, that I may have to move to a smaller apartment as my family grows, right? This is a position of economic precariousness. And please note, of course, this is still somewhat gendered in the United States. Men feel more of a responsibility to be able to earn enough to purchase the home. Please note that among the inroads that Donald Trump is making in 2024 is with young men, this group who can't afford to buy a home, right? And I think I better wrap it up for today. So there's a few minutes for questions, but we've talked about this before, right? The ratio of what a house costs to what income is it the worst place it's been in the history of data on this in the United States, right? It's at about a 6-to-1 ratio, and that just makes home ownership out of reach for people who are trying to do it based only on what they earn. 90% of first time home buyers in the United States get assistance from their family. If you have a family that already owns a home who's able to assist you, you're in the so called patrimonial or inherited middle class, right? If there's nobody in your family to help you, then you're probably locked out of the home ownership market. This is making people not only insecure, but angry. It is the core of the affordability crisis. It is precisely what inflation called our attention to. And even if the long term benefits of the Biden administration's approach to stimulus, to creating new jobs, has been to put us in a situation where people will be better off 5 years from now, 10 years from now, assuming this can be sustained. In the short term, people are paying much more attention to the inflation and for good and understandable reasons. All right, let me stop there. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Flossie, I can see you. Go right ahead. Remember to unmute yourself, please. You're still muted, Flossie.
It's no longer Abraham Lincoln. We need a different kind of father figure or mother figure. And it may not be Kamala Harris who can create the mother figure, but we certainly don't have an Abraham Lincoln. We are losing, I'm sorry to say, the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address. We're losing our history. That's what I feel now. And maybe I shouldn't feel so desperate, but I am, after all, a teacher who grew up in another time, and I feel that loss of history. I share that with you, David.
Yeah, sorry, Flossie. I'm going to point something out real quick. I was actually at a talk 2 nights ago by the one of the curators for the Smithsonian, who's just written a book about the wide awake movement, which I have to admit I was completely naive, completely ignorant about. But the wide awake movement was an abolitionist movement in primarily the 1850s, and they their symbol was a big wide open eye, and they marched through the streets carrying torches and dressed in black capes and big floppy white hats. A peculiar movement. And apparently they were instrumental to getting out the vote and getting Lincoln elected, right, in 1860. What I learned, among other things, at this talk, Lincoln only won about 30% of the popular vote.
Mm.
And so, right, it's useful to think through historically. Of course, he's Abraham Lincoln. He's the most important president in the history of the United States. He gave us the Emancipation Proclamation and, right, the Gettysburg Address. And yet, um, in his time, he was a highly polarizing, highly controversial figure. History sometimes moves in strange ways, and I think it's worthwhile noting that, especially as we try to get a little bit of bearing or orientation in what appears to be potentially quite disturbing times. But yeah, thank you for the comment, Flossie, and I do understand where you're coming from. I'll do my best to keep giving us resources and information with which to try to make sense of it.
Thank
Anybody
you.
else with a thought or a comment for today? Um, I'll say something just for a second. In order to share it with the people who don't attend live, we record these lectures and then I put them on YouTube, and that allows Genevieve and Amy to show them, I think, internally. And last week's lecture, because it's out there on YouTube, anybody can look at it who wants to. Over 1,000 people looked at. Isn't that interesting? I didn't have any idea I have no idea what it was about last week's
Good, good,
lecture.
good.
But something we did last week got some attention. So I thought that would be entertaining for you. You guys be well. Take
David,
care.
just one thing,
Oh yeah, go ahead, Sarah. I didn't see you. Go ahead.
one question.
Yeah.
Um, with what you've been talking about today, do you feel that Harris didn't sell? I mean, her down payment off. I mean, was that not properly handled as a potent issue?
So I don't think we're gonna know for months. Um, it appears to me Harris has concluded. I can only see what I see from her campaign, right? That she's not going to win this campaign by talking about $25,000 down payment assistance, or building 3 million new homes and giving tax breaks to developers to get the new homes built, and doing the best to leverage federal assistance to get regulation out of the way of new home building. She's got an interesting set of policy ideas for addressing the affordable housing crisis, and yet she's not talking very much about it. And here I've got my theories as to why she's not talking about it. I think there are several factors that could explain this. One of them is that she thinks it's unlikely she's going to control Congress, and she doesn't want to be held accountable for having a policy agenda that she can't implement. Another of them, I think, is that she knows that many voters are skeptical of Democrats actually implementing their plans. That Barack Obama and Joe Biden had all these great ideas, and that most people don't feel that enough of them were implemented or that they made enough of a difference in their lives to give them much credit for them. And so that going back to the well and saying, I've got more great policy ideas feels like more of the same, and what voters want is change. Third aspect of this is that the undecided voters who she needs to vote for her don't follow policy details. They're the most, right, um, disengaged of the voters that we have. They tune in a week before the election and try to figure out who they like better, not on the basis of their policy platforms, but just a take on their personality, whether they can trust them, whether they'll fight for them, something like that. And so those might all be reasons for her not emphasizing this. I think another question here is, should she have emphasized the success of Biden's right administration more?
Right.
And I don't know what to say. You want to win the election because you don't want Donald Trump to be the next president, because you think if you're the next president, you can do some good and that he's going to do a lot of bad. But you also have to use the election as an opportunity to illuminate some of the issues. If Joe Biden really did deliberately set in motion policies that cause some inflation, but the long-term effect of which is going to be very good for the working class and the middle class of the United States, you got to say that out loud in a way that doesn't sound like you're telling people that they don't know their own economic experience, right?
Yeah.
That's a losing approach. But that
Mm.
does say, by the way, didn't you get a raise? And I know you're pissed off about how much eggs cost and how much gas costs, but that's coming back under control. That raise is not going away. If you're patient, you may actually benefit from these policies. And that could be important for your future economic viability. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm talking to friends, and we've been talking for over an hour, and it makes it a lot easier to make that case. But I worry that Harris ran away from this a little bit, as opposed to trying to give the voters a little bit of credit for being able to understand something of a nuanced argument about this. It doesn't
Well,
help, of course,
mm.
that she's running against a dangerous demagogue who takes everything and distorts it, right? And so there's a lot of literature on this, which I'm not going to talk about today, but asymmetrical polarization. When one side says, we'll just lie, right? Or we'll just stoke the worst fears and worst impulses of the electorate. The other side can't just stay where it was before, right? The Republicans went in the direction of populism. Once that happens, the Democrats have to figure out how to react. And maybe that makes it really hard for them to run a normal policy oriented campaign. That
Right.
might be part
Sure.
of it also, Sarah.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right. Anybody else for today? Thanks as always for the good questions, for the good attention, for the opportunity to talk these things through with you guys. Be well. I will see you next week, and we will be hot on the heels of the election at that point. Be calm also, and take care.
Thank you.
See everybody in a week. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Take care. Thank you.